We've got a brilliant panel coming up next that I think, to Padma, to your quote from the Prime Minister around we need to do more, we need to do better, and perhaps we need to do things differently, is a really beautiful link to our next panel around the future of human rights in Australia. I'm not going to introduce Helen again, but I do want to ask everyone to make our next panel very welcome as we consider, what is the future of human rights in our country?
Thanks very much for that, Tash. And thanks, Padma. I've been frantically making notes because so much of what you said dovetails with what we're about to talk about. So I'd like to introduce you to the most wildly unsupported panel of this process so far. The problem with having your moderator being the person who's also running the event is that you don't get a lot of time to talk to your moderator. So one of the things I'm really comfortable about with here is that the people I've got sitting next to me are every one of them absolute experts in their area. And so what I really wanted to do here was, in that process of opening the address book, was to say, we have this wealth of knowledge in this country, this incredible expertise, which at this critical moment in Australian history, we really need to be starting to draw on in our own work. So just to set the stage a little bit, so I'm going to throw to each of our panellists in a moment with a question that's drawn from our discussion so far. But where the idea for this panel came from is that I should probably tell you a little bit about my relationship with human rights, because when I started studying law, for those of you who don't know, both of my parents are lawyers. My dad's a barrister, my mum was a solicitor and then a tribunal member. I never stood a chance. And I ended up doing my law degree. My career planning mostly consisted of a deeply felt desire to want to be able to sweep down a corridor like a bat, like my dad did in his robes, which is not the best basis for planning a career. As I discovered when I went to uni, and I found myself a little bit lost, sitting in a law school thinking, I don't care that much about contracts, until I did a summer course from a visiting professor from London in human rights, and I found my place. I suddenly understood that what interested me about law was the way it is an attempt by human beings to provide some structure to the relationships of power that exist between us. The way it provides a space for us to say there are things that are more important than who is in power, and the way it provides us with the tools and mechanisms for having serious discussions about who has power, who should have power, and how that power should be exercised and what the limitations should be. And in that space, I then launched cheerfully into a career in corporate law, which was another misstep, but one which I think gave me some of the important tools to be able to understand how power operates in our world. And the day that I marched into my managing partner's office and said, I'm off to be a human rights lawyer. And he said, who's poached you? And I said, no, I haven't been poached, I haven't got a job yet. I'm off to be a human rights lawyer. And he rolled his eyes. That was the beginning of my career. And so for me, everything that I've done here at ERA, everything I've done in my career in community law, has been with that framework of human rights are this incredible human invention, this thing that we created out of nothing in the ashes of following World War II. They are recent. The thing that keeps striking me is that this, last year was the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 75 years. Same year my mum turned 75, which tells you, this is something that has occurred in my mum's lifetime. An entire structure of understanding relationships between people and trying to make those relationships fair and productive and good. And so from my perspective, there is this moment in time where we've built something incredible, and yet during the time that I've spent working on the CRPD, the Convention on the Protection of Rights of People with Disabilities, the time I've spent working in the Commission on the Status of Women, I have seen that system come under systemic, well-resourced and very well-planned attack. When ERA was first set up, before my time, back in 2010, coming from an organisation that already existed called Women Speak, the people who were involved in setting up the organisation were so firmly of the view that this organisation should be built around a core of human rights, of the recognition of the rights of women, that they put it in the title. We're not the Equal Treatment or, we're not Gender Equality Alliance, we are the Equal Rights Alliance. And that's always been core to who we are. And yet, at the moment, if you look at pick up any document that's about gender equality in Australia, there's nothing about rights in it. The strategy does at least mention CEDAW. It's one of the few documents dealing with gender equality that actually does. And so what I'd like to do with this panel is to start to really dig into where we are in relation to human rights in Australia, what the threats are, and also what the opportunities, what the possibilities of human rights are in the context of gender equality. So on that basis, I'm going to start with Sarah because Sarah Goulding is from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and she has had a long career in a variety of different spaces within that department. And I'll leave you to sort of talk a little bit about some of that experience. But I'd like to know a little bit about how human rights are sitting within the work of DFAT at the moment. And I think it's fair to say that DFAT is one of the places in government at the moment where human rights is most deeply embedded. What are you seeing in terms of pushback? And what are you seeing in terms of the global mood on human rights?
Thank you, Helen. And look, it's an absolute privilege to be here today at this incredible gathering of some extraordinary leaders and advocates speaking on behalf of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So those of you that I don't know, I have the role as the Principal Sector Specialist for Gender Equality in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and lead the work on gender equality, disability and social inclusion. I'm here actually representing Bronte Mools, who's the inaugural ambassador for human rights. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to be here today. And it's very humbling to be in this room. I thought I'd reflect on this question Helen did give us. She said she didn't prep this panel, but we actually had an awesome chat last week about looking out and looking in. So looking out. When we speak about the international human rights landscape as Australia sees it and as we engage with it, there's a list of really important international human rights conventions that we've adopted and we've formally ratified, some of which, like the one on the rights of persons with disabilities, we're one of the first countries in the world to ratify. Others of which we've ratified over time. But as an advocate, Australia sees our importance of these international instruments as something that's absolutely fundamental to the world that we're in and promoting the ability of everybody in the world to participate and contribute to it effectively. And if you go back to the very, very first sort of extraordinary leadership of Jessie Street and the role that she played in the negotiations of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you can feel unbelievably proud as Australia that we have been at this table, part of this conversation, advancing and promoting human rights dialogues and reporting against them and integrating them in what we do in international foreign policy. So I have been given some notes, so I'll just speak to a few of them. I'm not as brave as Padma to just go completely off script. But I just wanted to be clear, like what we're talking about here when we look out and we look at the context of pushback is the 7 core human rights treaties which we've ratified around the Convention Against Torture, the Convention on Civil and Political Rights, CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the Convention on Economic and Social Rights. We can talk about the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And we actively engage and all member states of the UN, in a range of different ways, engage with the multilateral landscape that upholds, protects and promotes these international human rights conventions. And we report through the Human Rights Committee, a whole range of other committees, including the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, and it was wonderful to have Natasha Stott-Despoja re-elected for a second term after quite an extensive campaign that Australia led to see her on that committee. And then also to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, where we're privileged to have Rosemary Keys, our new Disability Discrimination Commissioner, as a leader. We report to those committees. And we engage very, very deeply in Geneva, in New York, in a whole range of other spaces, in multiple ways, in the room, outside of the room, at the table, behind the table, in the back doors of embassies, in the front rooms and speaking spaces, to promote and protect and uphold human rights principles. But this dynamic of pushback, it is a fundamental part of the landscape that we're in now. So when we look out, we see these extraordinary decisions that were adopted by member states, by governments represented kind of around the world, and us, really under threat. And that's fundamentally comes to the principles of universality and indivisibility of human rights, as enshrined in the Universal Declaration, but also in many of these other conventions. And when you use the language of human rights in international forums, there are times where it has been, you would think, because it's a universal declaration on human rights, really unifying. But it's not. It's more divisive than ever. And you cannot separate how that language and those norms are being contested in those multilateral forums internationally from geopolitical tension and geopolitical dynamics. These are front and centre to how this dynamic is playing out. And the language that gets used to describe this in a whole range of different ways is called pushback or rollback, and there's other terms. But it's really, to be very clear, an entrenched, very well funded, very well coordinated set of tactics by non-state actors and some governments, and they use the concern and inequality and norms that aren't seen, which means that gender equality is not a lived experience for anybody on the planet, and that resistance to that reform as an entry point for division. It's an instrument. It has an outcome, which is a rollback of women and girls' human rights and the human rights of other people, diverse gender identities, but that tension around access to sexual and reproductive health, to women's leadership, to women's economic participation, to sexual orientation, gender identity, LGBTI equality, is an instrument of division that plays out with a geopolitical overplay. And that West versus the rest narrative really persists. And that's the context that every time somebody representing our government in an embassy goes into a negotiation is needing to read in the room, is needing to use to shape their interventions, their formal statements and their backroom conversations. And these are very much driven in part by strong-held views and ideologies. But they don't just undermine gender, they undermine the idea of universal human rights being a gift for everybody, an enjoyment and a right for everybody, which makes it much harder to preserve and promote norms. So what are we doing? Well, we are staying at the table, number one. We are absolutely determinedly engaged, and we are upholding the principle of universality. But we're also looking, as Padma reflected, the Prime Minister had talked about in work on GBV, doing things differently. Because we all know you can sit at the table and read out your statement that makes brilliant sense from your own perspective. But if you're not listening to others, if you're not finding ways to build bridges, you're actually adding to that climate of tension, which is not productive, it's not helpful, and it doesn't shift. So we're doing a lot more listening. We're very clear and we share what we stand for, what our concerns are, and we do call out abuses. And we adapt what our assessment is of the entry points depending on the context. Now, I've talked a lot about how we do that multilaterally, but we also do it in bilateral human rights dialogues. We do it in a whole range of different places, and we do it through the work that we support through the International Development Programme. And even in the most repressive and constrained environments, we look to try and find openings to work constructively on any part of the human rights agenda, because if we find a space where we can work on any part of it, then that's an opening for other issues. But you're not always going to see us talking about how we're doing that publicly. We do use a lot of what we call in the shop quiet diplomacy. And the reason why you don't hear about it is because it's quiet. Because if we talked about it, then it wouldn't be quiet. But it can really drive change. Now, I just wanted to kind of look in to what reflected that might mean for us. You know, this contestation and pushback, you know, it happens multilaterally. It happens in other governments, in other countries around the world. We see it. Just have a look at the debates that there are in France, Spain, Italy. See what that's meaning in Europe, seeing what this means in other parts of the world where you're seeing that pushback. It is a multilateral and it's connected to national reform and it's financed to do that. We also see in this, when we look in, is that when we try and pick off different elements of a human rights agenda, and I mean, coming from my experience working in gender equality over a while, we often talk about these issues in silos. You've got your SRHR advocates that really focus on SRHR, and you've got other advocates that only focus on their issues, and they don't see the connections, but the tactics and the funding and the opposition is the same. So we have to join these things up. This intersectionality is critical. But it doesn't mean that you can't have wins if you're canny and you listen and you look for spaces. And you can have wins internationally and domestically on a human rights agenda. And I'll reflect on the fact that in 2023, just last year, the first bit of legislation was passed in the ACT to uphold the rights of people who are intersex against unnecessary medical treatment, and to support their ability to make decisions themselves about their identities and their bodies themselves. And this year, in February, the Human Rights Council passed the first ever international resolution upholding the rights of people who are intersex to make decisions about their bodies themselves. It's huge. And do you know what? With quiet diplomacy, if you look at all the countries on the Human Rights Council, us and a number of other governments made sure that there was not a single no vote. Amazing. So there's still amazing opportunities to progress human rights. And the last thing I wanted to say is sometimes when we talk about human rights in Australia, we see this issue as like an academic discourse that's not related to the lived reality. And we use other more instrumentalist kind of tools. We say, oh, we're going to focus on this issue because, not just because it's the right thing to do, but in the context of pushback, we go, oh, well, that's an uncomfortable, challenging debate. We'll focus on the benefits that it can bring, social or economic or, other instrumentalist, which is important. And some might say it doesn't matter because it's all about outcome. But actually, I was reflecting as I was preparing to come here on an encounter I had probably 30 years ago with someone who was a newly single mother, and I didn't have the language to understand what she was describing, but essentially she'd left her relationship because of coercive control. I don't think we used that language then. GBV was understood very differently. But she had on her wall, so every time she went in and out of the house, a printout of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. She looked at that and said, I have rights, these apply to me. The right for freedom of movement, the right to hold my own opinion, the right for freedom of expression. So there are ways in this context of pushback where we can continue to make rights very, very relevant to contemporary political debate. And so I think when we look out at the international sense and we look in at Australia, there are strategies each and every one of us can find to do this really well. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. And I wanted to start there because I think the outward and in piece is really important. We're an island nation, and frankly, we behave like it. There is a point where I think there are actually different Australia. We know there are different Australias existing within the same space here. We know that we have an ancient culture of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who have an Australia that is existing in itself and in totality. We have a population derived from a colonial history, and then we have a strong migrant population who are often often better connected to some of these concepts, have come from countries where there is a greater literacy around human rights. And I think I'd just like to identify that as one of the resources that Australia has, is a population that has both different ways of seeing rights and also different experiences of rights in other countries. And I think thinking about what you've just said, Sarah, I'm particularly struck by that point about how one of the things that hits us in the international space is how easy the job of the disruptors is. It's easy to stop progress. It's hard to make progress. And so the job that we're doing requires this extra level of effort, this extra level of work, whereas it's easy to simply disrupt. And so I think that's something that we need to keep in our minds. The other thing I would like to just highlight before we go on is how, because this Human Rights Project is young, it's evolving, and we've just heard that the latest resolution at the Human Rights Council on intersex rights is part of a program of work that's been done by activists across the world ever since the 80s and 90s, and even earlier, around actually recognising the rights of LGBTIQA+ people. And that work is an ongoing project. And it's a process that I think then holds lessons for the people who are working on a similar evolution in relation to Indigenous rights internationally. So we've got the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and that declaration raises a new concept in the area of human rights, which is cultural rights. And that's something that we are still working through. But the fact that it's a system in evolution makes it vulnerable to attack, because it's not a monolithic thing. It's not a well thought through thing yet. We're working it out. And so, Alice, I actually want to go to you next to talk a little bit about what that human rights framework looks like when it comes into Australia. So Alice is from the Human Rights Law Centre, which is one of the few places in Australia that's working at the coalface of how do you actually defend rights in Australia. And what I'm interested in is the work of the centre, and also how you see human rights within the Australian community. Is it an accepted idea? Is it something that people understand? Talk to us.
Yeah, thanks, Helen. We barely talk about human rights in Australia. We barely reference them, and I think there's a real danger in vacating that space, because when we do hear about human rights spoken of, it's actually often by the right or by people who have a really significant misapprehension and misunderstanding of what human rights are. So we saw this in COVID, for instance, where people were talking about the right not to wear a mask during a pandemic in Bunnings. You do not have a human right not to wear a mask during a pandemic. But we also see that language used by the right. You know, you have a right to be a bigot, you have a right to engage in hate speech, extremely damaging, troubling misuse of human rights language and human rights principles. And I think that's because, being an island nation, we have sort of abdicated human rights language. And I think at the Human Rights Law Centre, we work with a network of organisations globally that work on human rights. And I can promise you that human rights language and principles are no more important than to those organisations from the global south. And they know exactly, those folks know exactly how important it is to maintain the language of human rights, because they are facing, you know, human rights defenders are facing raids, they're facing prison time every single day. And so for no other reason than being a good global citizen, we need to start taking human rights more seriously here in Australia. And not just in quiet diplomacy, as incredibly important as that is, but also here in Australia. And Padma mentioned that we're in a moment right now in Australia. I'm also going to pause to say, and to add to Padma's very impressive resume. Padma was on the board of the Human Rights Law Centre for many years, and really crucial to our work. We're in a moment in Australia where we have an opportunity to seize a Human Rights Act federally. We're also in a moment, really crucially when it comes to gender equity, to strengthen and achieve human rights acts in every state and territory in Australia. So just to pause on the federal one for a moment, the government-controlled, government-dominated committee at federal level, the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights, has come out and said Australia should have a Human Rights Act, and it should include civil and political rights, and really crucially it should also include economic, social and cultural rights. We would add to that other rights, like the right to self-determination, particularly for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia. Cultural rights, incredibly important to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. What we'll see through such a Human Rights Act is two things: that human rights will have to be, by law, at the heart of every single decision and government policy that the federal government passes down. So we're talking about gender equity budgeting. This is an opportunity to do the equivalent of that across all federal government laws and policies. The second thing, and the thing I'm really excited about as a lawyer, is it gives people an opportunity to defend their rights when they're ignored and when they're breached by governments. This shouldn't be controversial. And what we're doing is equipping ordinary people with a new tool to hold governments to accountable. Governments that should be serving their interests at every single turn. And just to bring it into like a sort of gender equity example, where human rights acts are performing well, it means a social worker has an opportunity and a pathway to ensure a woman who is seeking crisis accommodation can do so in a culturally appropriate and culturally safe way. It means that a woman will not be shunted into a backpacker's mixed dorm with men, with shared bathrooms, which we know in effect will mean that she won't be able to leave her family violence situation. It will mean that entire gender equity policies developed by government and family violence response plans will have to consider the rights of women in all of their aspects. So it includes considering, women's rights through education, through equal work opportunities and pay, things like that. So it really is, it's like the wonky government level of impact, but it also has very real important impacts on women's everyday lives, particularly when we're talking about women experiencing violence.
Thanks, Alice. And just a quick follow-up on that. The government's committee, the Joint Parliamentary Committee on Human Rights, we need acronyms in this world, don't we? Like, you can't not have them. Has made the recommendation about a Human Rights Act. Are we literate enough in this country about human rights to have that debate, do you think?
Are we literally what, sorry?
Are we literate enough? Yeah.
Look, this is a challenging moment. It's our job at the Human Rights Law Centre to increase the literacy of people to talk about human rights. I would extend that invitation to everybody in this room. We need to start talking about things in a human rights frame and actually understand what they mean. They're not these sort of far-off things that apply to overseas jurisdictions and not us. I think the concern that we're facing is that there is a pretty strong, staunch, well-funded right-wing campaign machine in Australia. We saw that during the Voice referendum campaign. And that is the reality of what we're up against, and they will also use the language of rights against the Human Rights Act. They're already doing so, but we don't have another option. So we have to bring the fight where it is, and we have to do our very best job of it. And we'll only have a chance at this if we have a united front of people talking about how rights impacts them and human rights improves their lives, whether it's because they're a person with disability, because they're a woman, because they're a person of colour, because they're all three. That's the only way that we'll actually win this.
Thanks. And I think that's actually critically important, isn't it? That it can't be the Human Rights Law Centre's job to educate us. It has to be a process, I think, where we all develop our own language. We need an Australian language about human rights. How often have we heard, people quoted in newspapers or online as saying, I'm going to, my right to bear arms, or my right to, this language which is clearly drawn from the US around rights. And the US has different founding myths to us. They've got a founding myth that is around, or a mythology that's around the rights of the individual and freedom of the individual. In Australia, we've got a different narrative. We've got a narrative that's around fairness. We've got the fair go, the idea that there should be balance. And it feels to me like we don't have that language yet. So thank you. Sevda, I'm going to go to you next because you're sitting, you have an extraordinary career, have had an extraordinary career so far, which has spanned academia and then and also working in government and working in human rights, both in Australia and internationally. When you are looking at human rights as a tool, what do you see as being the potential in Australia for us using human rights in the work that we're doing as gender advocates?
Thank you, Helen. I've had the privilege of being part of the conversation in the room, and amazing energy. I want to thank everyone for that. But also the curse of being later in the day and trying to tie together all the distinct threads that we've been hearing about one particular word, silo, whether it be portfolio silos at the government level, or whether it be all the discrete pieces of work. We're all chipping away at the same block, but we can't quite articulate what that block is. And I think the value, and you use the word disruption, Helen, I'd written that in my notes, but I'm going to use it positively. I'm here to disrupt, in a sense, and I want us to step back and take a view of the sweeping landscape that we've been hearing about today and thinking, well, how can we connect all of these disjointed pieces together? Human rights gives us that language. And I think despite the pushback, despite the historical lack of traction for it, we really have a moment at the moment, and we heard Padma saying that earlier, for us to seize the potential. And why is human rights important? It's not a set of moral principles, as you said, Helen. It's very much a set of political ideas that we've come up together internationally with, and post-colonial states had a huge role to play in the way that human rights were framed at the international level. So we've got the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, successively then articulated into binding international contracts that states have signed up to, that we call treaties, including Australia. When it comes to international trade law, Australia takes it a lot more seriously domestically. But human rights, I think Nikki said this yesterday about her work as the Victorian Commissioner for Gender Equity. She has to convince these public sector actors that this is a law that they're reporting on. But when it comes to gender, it's soft and fluffy and it's not binding. But we've signed up to binding agreements that it's not the Human Rights Law Centre's job to educate on human rights education. It's the government's obligation to do so. That it's willingly adopted internationally. So for us, we can galvanise around that language. Now, I want to challenge equality as a paradigm as well, because equality, the way I see it in a human rights framework, it's a means. But where are we getting? Where are we all going? And I think that's what we're trying to, that's where the shoe is pinching. But the end is human flourishing, as articulated in Article 1 of the Universal Declaration, that each and every human being has the right to live in dignity. And we talk about intersectionality. Now, conceptually, we will thrash this out, I'm sure, between us today, rest assured. But for the moment, we talk about primary prevention, whole of community approaches. Whole of self approach is what human rights is. And it says, no, you don't just exist as a woman or as a non-binary person, or to use the legal language, all the protected attributes. You exist as a chocolate lover, as a person who loves to jet ski, as a person who loves, in all of your complexity. And CEDAW, quite frankly, is not enough to get us there. Now, I say that as a human rights lawyer who's part of a project with my colleague Perla Juaneros, and we're looking at CEDAW and the way that NGOs in Australia engage with the CEDAW processes at the UN. And our findings, not surprisingly, show us that there's a lot of illiteracy about human rights. And I saw this at the Disability Royal Commission. Quite well-meaning public policy analysts were constantly feeling the need to cross the human out of the human rights picture. And that's why I think disability is such a red thread for us, because the disability rights movement, as beautifully codified in 2008 in the CRPD, shows not just the trajectory and the building up and the momentum behind human rights and its more sophisticated articulation compared to, say, CEDAW, but it also gives us tools that we can use. And the one tool that we get from disability is, and I put it to you that it's really the lowest common denominator for rights. If you can protect the rights of people with disability, you've got everybody covered. And that's intersectionality at work. So CEDAW is very much so in the human rights framework, respect, protect and fulfil. They're the three, that's the tripartite obligations the states have. Respect, meaning don't interfere, the classic liberal, do not deprive. And where existing policies exist, ensure that you carry them out and make them available on an equal basis. But it doesn't give you an obligation to create policy. That's the respect obligation. Protect, government must come in and protect individuals against private party interferences, whether it be multinational corporations or family members. That's a critical obligation. We see that articulated in the Modern Slavery Act, somewhat. Then you've got fulfil, and this is where CEDAW doesn't get us far enough. And equality paradigm doesn't take us there. Fulfil is where the government has the primary obligation. Positive duties, which are now that language that's on the march in Australia. Thank you, Victoria. I say that as a New South Welsh woman. And the Disability Royal Commission recommended them. The latest review of the Queensland Anti-Discrimination Act also recommended positive affirmative duty, they use that language, is preventative. It's not just tackling, trying, and we're all firefighters. And we're wondering why we can't solve the problem. Because we're constantly in high alert mode. We haven't had the time to do that framing piece, but human rights does it for us. And it says human rights prevents violations from occurring in the first place. Because what we want as women, as non-binary people, as children, as girls, is to live a life of dignity. So then equality is a tool along the way. And so in the CRPD, for instance, we have language of accountability that we can draw on in Article 33. It sets out, it's it's revolutionary in terms of human rights, but it uses this language of governmental focal points. And so that ended up in the Disability Royal Commission recommendations. That government should, and AGD is currently the designated focal point. And we quizzed federal and state and territory governments, and we said, who are your focal points? Quite a few responses came back and said, well, what is a focal point? Now, the focal point is responsible for that translation piece. They take UN and they bring it home. They disseminate the committee findings and the views. That's one piece of their work. And the translation piece is also being a conduit for the ground up and NGO representation through government. So that's a missing piece of the puzzle in Australia. But I think the language and the tools we have will get us there. So plug in for the Human Rights Act and advocacy around that.
Thanks, Sevda. And I think that's a critical point, isn't it, that that when we're, sorry, I'm going back a little bit in what you were saying, but that point about the fact that CEDAW, incredibly important convention that we build a lot of our work around, is a convention on the elimination of discrimination against women. It's literally about one of our rights. And we don't push out beyond that into the International Convention on the Economic, Social and Cultural Rights of Women, into the Conventions on Civil and Political Rights. We don't push out into those other rights, and certainly not in the language we use. And I'm just thinking back to Padma's point earlier about the fact that in order to get this across to people, we simplify, but we mustn't use the simplification as the basis for our thinking. We have to, the communication at that level is important, particularly when we're working against ignorance of the level that Padma is describing. But we can't keep that as our thinking framework. We have to open out into the possibility. And I think one of the things that we've been seeing over the last couple of days, the last day, is that it feels like there's a lot to do. I'd like to reframe that, because I think that one of the things human rights gives us is that it says there's a lot of space for us to play in. We are not constrained. The fact that there is so much to do is an indication that there is so much we could achieve, and that's space for us to stretch out into. So I think that's an important framing for us. And I think the other thing, before we go to the other thing, I am now going to go to Virginia, because this is the point where I like to think about human rights as being the solution. Let's problematise things a bit, because one of the things that we can say is that it's a system in evolution, and one of the things that we as a group of advocates talk about is intersectionality. We've all got the word, we know how to insert it into sentences. Now, how do we insert it into the world? So, Virginia, what do human rights look like when you're looking at the concept of intersectionality?
Thank you, and thank you for having me here, because I've been sitting here listening to everybody talk, and I'm like, I don't even know what I'm going to contribute to this panel, but it's very interesting. And just kind of listening to you speak as well, I'm kind of also filtering through the lens of that intersectionality kind of thinking, which is where my interests really lie in, because I feel like in Australia we are becoming more and more aware of the need to be intersectional in the work that we do, wherever it sits, and all that kind of stuff. But when I'm sort of thinking about human rights, I kind of like remember an article that I read, whether it was in 2022 or 21, I can't remember, from ABC, and it said something around like, is intersectionality interfering with or bringing an end to human rights or something like that. And I remember reading that article, and there's some good things in there about how they were trying to navigate intersectionality and human rights, and to see where that kind of where that plays in. And I sort of think maybe that was the wrong question. Maybe the question to ask would have been like, what does intersectionality allow us to do in the space of human rights? And when I think about it, I really go back to what Sevda was just saying in terms of like when, for example, when we're working in the gender equality space, it's the CEDAW kind of thing that really, that's the center for us. And I think about how the United Nations and all the treaties and whatnot, they're actually really in that silo kind of thing. So it's not that surprising that when we work, we're sort of working in those silos anyway, because the instruments that are really informing the work that we're doing, they're really that siloed anyway. So to me, kind of, it's like, well, I get I get that we needed to be that way when all of these things were happening and when we're starting to put this at the forefront and whatnot, we needed to be like that. But I think our thinking and our work has grown to that point where we're like, well, actually, that allowed us to move so far to get to where we are. But now we understand, as Padma said, that the question is actually not a simplistic question. It's a really complex one. And those things that got us to where we are not necessarily going to move us forward. And so that's where I sit. I sort of sit where I'm like, this is not to undermine or devalue anything, the work that's been done in the past that's really significant and important, but it got us here where we are today. And we need to think a bit more nuanced, where we need a tool that's that allows us that kind of more ability to navigate the complexity of what is facing us. And it's good to know that even at the UN level, this idea of intersectionality is actually also really, it's something that is really quite gaining traction as well, that they're also understanding that in the work that we're doing at the UN level, it needs to be intersectional, it needs to to be able to deal with the complexity. And I get the allure of intersectionality in that sense, in what it allows us to see. It allows us to focus on the most marginalized. Because if you really think about women as a group, for example, what the gender equality work that you've all in this room have done, where it's got us here, it's got us to a place where, yeah, we're not where we want to be, but we're going in a direction where, we've had some gains, right? But those gains, you look at who has actually really benefited from those gains and who has been left out of those gains. And so it means even the gender equality work that we're doing, the instruments that are informing us in the work that we do, they need to look different and feel different, and they need something else, which is that intersectional, with that intersectional lens. It allows us to focus on that. The other thing it does, it allows us to give, so this is even in the human rights space, it allows us to focus on power. And I feel like we talk about power a lot in Australia, but we mention power. We don't actually unpack power, what it means, because I kid you not, if we even unpacked power even in this room, there's some fantastic things that will come out even in this room in terms of where does power actually sit, and what does that actually mean in terms of the voices that are being heard and the voices that are not at the table. So for me, that's the other kind of allure of intersectionality in the human rights space, that ability to really interrogate power, to understand not only where it sits, but what happens when it interacts with other forms of power that lead to oppression and marginalization. So I think those are really good. There's a really important things that intersectionality allows us to do. My question, and I'm going to be a little bit more controversial. Yeah, surprise, surprise. But maybe not even controversial. Maybe just again to use disruption in a positive way. Maybe just disruptive in terms of, I get that allure. I get what it allows us to do in the human rights space. My issue is, do we actually know what it is to allow us to do those things, right? And that's where I was sitting even in the last couple of days, where I'm kind of hearing the word being used. I'm like, I don't know that I can actually, if someone would say, tell us, I go back to my organization and they say, oh, so what did they say about intersectionality? I'll be like, we talked about it a lot, but what did we say? I'm like, we talked about it a lot. I don't actually know that I can take anything that we can say, even as a feminist movement in Australia, what is our actual position? What are the tenets of intersectionality when we sit there and we say, now, intersectional feminist thinking in Australia entails 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I don't know what those is, and I'm happy for people in the room to educate me on that, on these are the tenets of intersectional feminist thinking in Australia, and this is how it actually impacts on the work that we do. Because tell you what, for me, what I think is an intersectional lens is so radical. And I use that word in the most positive way that I can think of. It's so radical, inherently radical in its bones. It's inherently radical that we have to completely change, 180 in terms of the way that we think about the world, we see the world, the way we move through the world, and that means centering voices that frankly speaking, the majority of which aren't even in this room. We can't do it ourselves. Because what I think is happening is when we're thinking about intersectionality in the human rights space, we're trying to process it through what we've always done, which is that single lens. That's what we sort of say we're being intersectional, but then we're sort of thinking, I mean, this is how I'm seeing the work. I'm not trying to kind of say that's what everybody does, but the way that I look at it is, if we're thinking of intersectionality still processing it through what we've always done, that's not going to work. What we need to process it through is, what we need to do is actually get the voices that are actually at those intersections, that are actually at those, I think two of us at this panel already mentioned, and Padma did the same thing about, you actually center or you plan for the margins, for the most marginalized, and by default everybody else is included. And I think that's what intersectionality will allow us to do in the human rights lens and in the human rights space. But I don't think we're doing that yet, because to plan for the margins, we need to get the people at the margins to the center, and they're not there yet. I think the people at the center are acknowledging that, but I don't know that we're actually physically doing it. And so for me, I don't know, I've gone around in circles, but basically I can see the allure of intersectionality in the human rights space, but I am also still very confused about, and when I use confused, I'm trying to be polite, about what we're using it for. About what we're understanding about the term itself. Yeah. The term itself, so that conceptual clarity is missing. And I think then we're all rushing to be like, we acknowledge and then we think we've done, because we actually aren't getting that conceptual clarity. So if one thing that I can learn from this and I can get from people in the room is that kind of like, this is what an intersectional, feminist intersectional kind of framework in Australia actually looks like, and this is what it allows us to do. So that's not an answer, but maybe let me stop there and see if there's questions that I can speak to.
It's the best kind of answer, actually. There are a couple of key threads there which I think actually form the backbone of what it is we're doing here over a day and a half, which is, you're talking about how human rights, I've talked about how human rights are a process that we are still moving through. You're talking about how intersectionality is a process where we're much, much further back in working through what that means. The metaphor I think of is archaeology. Where you remove one layer and eventually you've found, a whole wall that's from a Roman civilization or whatever, or, you've found the footings for the fish trap, and then you look underneath that and you find something else. And that's where we are, right? That's the process we're engaged in. But it's, in terms of intersectionality, it's not, we talk a lot about intersectionality, and when we think really hard, we get as far as voice. And in fact, voice is just the means to doing intersectionality.
But it's not, but when we talk, sorry to interject, but I feel like even when we talk about voice, we actually don't know what that means, even. And I know I keep saying we don't know what that means, but I'm a sociologist, so yeah, blame me. But seriously though, so we wrote, I work for Diversity Council Australia in my day job, and we wrote some guidelines on how to center voices of marginalized groups at work, in the workplace. And when we were writing that, even us ourselves were like, oh my goodness, we do not know what that means ourselves. Like, we have been advising people, center voice, and they came back to us and they said, and they said, what does it mean to center voice? We hear you, DCA, you're saying center voice, thank you. Center voices of marginalization, but what does it mean? Yeah. And we're like, it means center voice. So we started to actually unpack it, and we realized it's actually this complex thing. And we realized what people have been doing is actually consulting at best. Yeah. So we have our agenda. Here's our agenda. So, Virginia, can you tell us what you think this means? And I'm like, actually, you asked the wrong question. Yeah. That is not even the question that affects me in my human rights in Australia. So, for example, I'm sitting here, I'm listening to, and I'm going to be controversial. I'm sitting here and I'm like, it's a gender equality discussion. I'm like, actually, I don't even know if that particularly works for me. Because if the entry point is gender for Virginia Mapedzahama, I don't even know if that's the thing for me in Australia. For me in Australia, I'm not just a woman. I'm not even a woman. Do you know when I walk down the street, and I will bet you $1 million for this, when I walk down the street, people don't see a woman. They see either a black woman, a black African woman. They might even just see a black person, not even a black woman, right? So then if the entry point is gender, I don't know where that sits in my lived experiences here. It means the entry point needs to be something that actually allows, you know, you were talking about your whole self, that allows, you know what I mean? Like it has to be something that enters with my race, with my, migranthood, with whatever, all of those identities that are marginalized for me, or that are marginalizing for me. So what am I saying? I'm saying even the notion of centering voice, when we know how to do it well, the narrative will 100% change. Then what do we do when the narrative changes? Do we have the systems and the structures to actually do it? So I think genuine intersectionality with us really understanding what it means to center voice will be so difficult to do if we're not thinking in that way. And it will also require a complete rethinking. I don't know that we can do that, but all I know is that's what it requires. And everybody keeps telling me, it's so hard, Virginia. I'm like, well, so then deal with it. That's what we have to do to genuinely bring those most marginalized of any group. Because what we've done so far is allowed us to look at the bigger picture. To unpack that picture, we need a different way of thinking, and we need a different way of centering marginalized voices. So in the end, we did come up with a set of guidelines at DCA. It's on our website. But those guidelines really show you, like, the step-by-step on what do you do when you center the voices of marginalized. And if you do that, it will actually change the narrative. The question is, what do you do when the narrative changes?
And no, I'm going to go to Sevda because I think you have a comment to make on this. Go, Sevda.
Burning for one. Thank you, Helen.
Yeah.
Virginia, music to my ears. And what does it mean to centre voice? We're seeing that we're making progress. It's challenging, but in the disability space, we're talking about the National Disability Data Asset. Talking about data. And that means giving people with disability, and the word is authority over that data, not just ipso facto after the fact, but the data collection stage. And we all know, and it was said yesterday, that data is not neutral. And whoever frames the questions of the census has a particular underlying objective that comes out in not just the responses that you get, but the responses you don't get. And so we're seeing this in First Nations data sovereignty. Why? And this is where power comes in. It's shifting the source of power and authority from the professors in our predominantly white institutions to First Nations women who own that data collection from the very beginning. You can't retrofit data later. You can't disaggregate it later. And that's what companies are finding now when they're having to report against gender equality. They're not reporting instances of sexual harassment at work. People aren't, and they're not gathering that data, so it's not even a question of retrofitting it after the fact. But the lived experience is fundamentally shifting the source of authority for that information and ownership over that data as an example. Again, disability theory is so enlightening for us. And we talk about the paradigm shift of the CRPD. And what does disability theory offer us? It offers us, again, bringing the human back in to that discussion. So if you've got that mindset of hearing the human, and consultation is a lovely word, but we're there. And Disability Royal Commission, as part of the Disability Rights Act, we recommended that part of it be the duty to consult. Human Rights Commission did the same thing with its Human Rights Act proposal. They called it the participation duty. But we know consultation is often a monologue, a soliloquy, and then it's not a genuine conversation with listening. And it doesn't shift the stage and have the lived experience sitting here and the government sitting there. And I think that's what it represents. So Paulo Freire, in his Pedagogy of the Oppressed, he did intersectionality, if you ask me. He brought class in. He brought gender in. He didn't use the word, but what did Crenshaw do? And this is what can help us get some conceptual clarity. Crenshaw was a lawyer. And her critique, she aimed straightly and squarely at anti-discrimination legislation, which failed to capture the experience of black women. And why? Because it's single ground. Virginia, you have to shed all your other identities to take a case to knock on the courthouse door. As far as the courts are concerned, you're a woman. But that fails to capture that experience that you have that the African Australian man doesn't have, right? And that's what intersectionality started off with. We had a consolidated anti-discrimination bill before Parliament in 2012. Now, when Labor got ousted, it was shelved. Can I see that revived, people? That had an intersectionality provision. Probably would have been the first in the world, perhaps except in Canada, always seems to lead the way, or Victoria. Victoria doesn't yet have one. But what did it do? It said, can we combine a couple of protected attributes, please? So it's not just a random, it's research-based. Historical stigma and injustice can be, we've got all the data there. And to say, well, I'm experiencing this discrimination as an Asian Australian woman in the workplace, and not just a woman, because my Asian male colleagues are not experiencing that. We've had a few cases in New South Wales to that effect, sexual harassment cases. And the courts can't deal with it until they're given the tools. And once we get, and again, full disclaimer, big believer in the stick legally. The carrots can take us so far, but we do need the stick to say, here's the legislation, and then the acculturation piece follows, I think. Then the language is built around it. But I think, yeah.
Intersectionality and voice as a transfer of power and a reconceptualisation of power rather than as a process and a checkbox. Yeah, okay. I think we made some progress. There's an awful lot more we could say, but I would like to throw for a couple of questions just in case anyone has any. Can we get a microphone runner? Sorry, Rach, I'm going to make Rach run all the way from the back of the room. Sorry. We'll go to Tanya and then to Menika, and I'm afraid that's all we've got time for.
Thank you, panellists. I spent a decade in human rights litigation before I decided to focus mostly on gender equality. And I just wanted to ask you all, there is a difference between the gender equality, between the human rights that is embodied in a Gender Equality Act and what is in Victoria's Human Rights and Responsibilities Charter and what the vision is of implementing human rights in that charter. I actually think the gender equality legislation in Victoria is more successful. I just wondered if the panellists might be able to reflect on, if we're talking about what the future is for human rights in Australia, what should that piece of legislation look like nationally if it's going to have real teeth?
Who'd like to take that? Alice, do you have a view on the Gender Act?
I can give it, I can give it a first stab. So I think difficulties that we have in Victoria with the human rights legislation in the charter here is that there's things like the piggyback clause, which, not to get too legalistic, but you can't bring a claim under the charter unless you have grounds for a claim in another law, which is absurd. So there's very sort of clear-cut things that we would absolutely not want to see replicated in any other jurisdiction and not federally, which I think would improve things. I think it's also, we should be upfront about what a federal act can and can't do as well, which is slightly separate to your point, but I think it sort of draws your point up to what is happening at federal level. Jurisdictionally, a lot of the issues that impact people's rights are actually governed by the states. So we're talking about health and education and policing, etc. Typically the domain of the states. And so how much a federal Human Rights Act has to do depends on how much that act will actually govern state laws, override state laws and govern state bodies. So there's some very kind of legalese things that we absolutely need to get right, both at state and federal level. But I think that there's some truth in the fact that siloed laws that focus on different areas of marginalisation are more tailored and can be more impactful. What we then lose is that approach of intersectionality where a government has to respond to someone on the basis of all of their whole self, all of their attributes, all of their experience, because we do risk that situation where someone is responded to on the basis of their gender, not on the basis of their race and gender and queerness and everything else. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword, I think.
Thanks. And Menaka.
Thank you for taking my question, or rather comment. Sevda and Virginia, I am so deeply thrilled to hear you speak about intersectionality in the terms that I've experienced it. Triple whammy of sexism, racism, and ageism. How do I solve, or how do I get redress for some of the ways that are maybe marginalized or pushed apart from having a voice or having my problems, whether it's in health or aged care or going to the gym or whatever, addressed? How? And I'm really thrilled to hear you speak about it. What is the way forward?
Who'd like to take that one?
What is the way forward? I did say I'm a sociologist, right? So we kind of take things apart, we don't build them. But not necessarily. I mean, for me, and I do, those of you that know me know that I sound like a broken record with this, because I think, at least in the area of intersectionality and having it inform our work, for me, the way forward is actually, someone talked yesterday, who was it that talked about the new power and the locus, changing the locus of like power, that needs to happen. So it's not just, we can't just think about, power needs to shift, but it's actually really understanding what it means to actually shift power and to share power. And that needs to really be centering the voices of the most marginalized. To me, that's the way forward, because what that will do is that will change even our priorities. Because I don't even know if our priorities are enough or nuanced enough or sophisticated enough or comprehensive enough to actually deal with the issues that you're dealing with, being at the intersections of all those structures of oppression. It means we just really need a different way of thinking, and to me that really goes to power and voice, and because we need so let me just, I know we're running out of time, but let me just give an example of my daughter, who was supposed to write a thing in her uni, an essay in her uni days about intersectionality, and she said, "What is it? I've never heard of it, Mom. I don't know what it means. Is it a thing? Like I feel like universities make up words." And I said, "Okay, forget about the words. To illustrate that you know what it is, can you tell me about your life in Australia as a young woman?" And she said, "What are you talking about, Mom? I'm not a young woman. I'm a young black woman." And I said, "Oh, okay, tell me what that means." And then she started to ramble on, and she went on. And she shared actually some really challenging things of her as a young woman, young black woman growing up in Australia that up until that time we hadn't actually talked about as a mother and daughter. And so as she was talking, I said, "Oh, so tell me about your friend Lydia. Do you share those things?" And she said, "I can't talk to Lydia about this because Lydia says just blah, blah, blah." And she started, so even though she doesn't know the word intersectionality, she has the embodiment of it. So for me, when I think about shifting power, I'm like, Bria, I'm going to come back to something you said yesterday, which is, what did you say, like, move over, or you got to know when to shut up, or something like that. So I think for me, that's what needs to happen with intersectionality. It's like, okay, let's kind of go back to the basics, to people who actually have the embodiment and the experience of it, because they will educate us on what we need to how we need to shift our thinking so that we can actually come to those things. Because even I, as I'm sitting here, I'm like, I don't think I've actually had the opportunity to actually sit down and actually talk to people and say, this is what we need to do to change the thinking. So that's why I keep saying I don't have the solution, because I haven't been given the space enough in Australia. Everybody's just talking about intersectionality. I'm like, what do we actually mean by it? Can I tell you how I live my life? And I know everyone's talking about lived experience. And even, I think when we're talking about lived experience as well, we actually are very, very much at the danger of just consuming trauma, like just trauma porn. Virginia, tell us about your experiences as a black woman in Australia. I'm like, yeah, I just want to hear me talk about how I suffer, don't you? And then I tell you, and then you're like, fascinating. I'm like, no, it's not. It's actually really, really challenging. You've just consumed my trauma. It's trauma porn. I wrote a paper on this. That's how passionate I am about when you center lived experiences, when you're talking about lived experience, you got to know also how to do it well, to get to what you're asking so that it doesn't actually just end up being about consuming trauma. So what's the way forward? Simple. Can you move aside and let the people with actually the lived experiences of this concept that you're talking about really genuinely be at the table in enough numbers and enough diversity to actually tell you, so you disrupt, your entire thinking is disrupted, and then we build it up again. I don't know who's going to do that, because, but you know what I mean? Like, it needs to be from the ground up if we're going to do intersectionality.
Thanks, Virginia. We are actually well over time, so I am going to call it there. I'm sorry about that, because I know we've got at least 2 more people who've got incredibly important things to say. But look, thank you all very much. I think this is a discussion that absolutely needs to keep going, and I'm wondering whether we need a further webinar. So watch this space, but thank you all for your attention. And the one thing I would like to leave you with is that what ERA has given me is the ability to go out into the world on a regular basis and meet other people having exactly the conversations that we're talking about here. They're out there, they're doing it, and that question I posed at the beginning of yesterday is, what are our resources? They are a resource. And when we pull ourselves back from the international space and when we don't engage with what's happening out there, we ignore that entire pool of work that's being done, and we ignore those fabulous women and the resource that they are to us, and we don't give them what we could be giving to them. So please do think about a future where whatever we come up with for the future is engaged in the international and in the human rights. Thanks.
That was brilliant. I think we have morning tea now for the next 20 minutes, and I think it's at the back. So I welcome you all to have tea and coffee and have a chat, and I'll see you guys soon.